Everybody. So we have two masters to talk about advocacy on palliative care today. So we know that for maybe for the last few years, we have had many benefits or we earned many things in international palliative care scene, and it is possible only with advocacy. So today we have Katherine Pettus and Smriti Rana for handling this session on advocacy. So Katherine is a senior advocacy and partnership director for International Association of Hospice and Palliative Care, and she has done a lot in advocacy aspects. So she represents IHBC at meetings in United Nations organization to ensure inclusion of palliative care and essential palliative care medicines and many other things. And she works towards the IHBC vision of a world free from health-related suffering. She has developed an online course on advocacy and many other things. She has written 2 books and many other articles on this subject. And she actually got, she has a doctorate in political theory from Columbia University and a master's degree in health law and policy from University of California, San Diego, and an arts law degree from City University. So welcome, Katherine. And next speaker, Smriti Rana. So Smriti is the head for strategic programs and partnership in Palliative India. She has been working in palliative care since 2000s, and she has her own personal experiences with which she was attracted towards palliative care. And she represents Palliative India in various forums like WHO, UNODC, and she is the India focal point for International Association of Hospice and Palliative Care in India, and is a board member at the International Drug Policy Consortium. So welcome, Smriti, and I would request Katherine first to walk us through her slides. So it's over to you, Katherine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll share my screen if that's okay. Am I allowed to?
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. Give me a minute to do that. It's not letting me share partially. Can you, I need to share advanced, and it's, your screen doesn't let me do that.
Shapriya?
Ma'am, you already have the permission to share your screen.
Yeah, but I need to go to advanced and then share partially, and it doesn't look like my normal slide. Shri, because this is an issue and I don't want to take up more time, can you play the video then?
Sure, I can do that. No worries.
Because otherwise I can't read my notes.
Okay. So with your permission, maybe we can play the video which you had sent. Sunil sir, shall I go ahead?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, sir.
Apologies on my end. Hi, everybody. I'd like to begin this session with gratitude, thanking Dr. Kumar, Dr. Raj, and Smriti for inviting me to speak to you today. The topic of my talk is really the modern tragedy of global inequity in access to public health palliative care and essential medicines. But it's the same time a story about the triumph of the world that we're emerging into much more slowly than we would like, from the tragedy through the development of palliative medicine and science, united with compassion, because those things converge in community palliative care, like the Kerala model. I see palliative care as an evolutionary force that can help societies emerge and evolve from the indifference to suffering that we have now to active involvement in the relief of suffering, like a few communities are doing around the world, to promote the common good. And you're part of that now. So I'm going to introduce you to the International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care, which of course we'll hope you'll join. I'm going to define some key terms, including advocacy and serious health-related suffering. I'm going to give you some background to the term narcotic drugs, speed through the global framework to relieve serious health-related suffering, which you can learn more about by taking my advocacy course, and review the ethical obligations of palliative care providers, and look at the national obligations very quickly at the end of Indian citizens to engage in reform. But first of all, happy International Women's Day. As many of you know very well, the majority of caregivers and palliative care providers, informal providers, often some professional, are women. Worldwide, more than 65 million women provide unpaid labor in the form of care for children, older persons, and their families. And caregiving duties often preclude women from gaining paid employment and education. So caregivers are really, according to one of your Indian caregiver organizations, Sakti, are the invisible warriors who are under-recognized, underappreciated, and underserved. Palliative home care and hospice services provided at the community level could significantly relieve caregiver burden and improve the quality of life for patients and their families. As you know, in Kerala, because you're doing that. In addition to palliative care support, the IHPC, which is the organization I work for, International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care, we advocate for a living wage for caregivers, even just a stipend, but something, because right now most people get nothing. So first of all, what is IHPC? The International Association for Hospice and Palliative Care, of course. It aligns with caregiver support, which I was just talking about, is one thing, but many of the work, things that you're doing, align with IHPC's vision of a world free from health-related suffering, where all people with palliative care needs get the services they need. So our mission is to serve as a global platform to inspire, inform, and empower individuals, governments, and organizations to increase access to and optimize the practice of palliative care. And we do this through our 4 pillars of work: advocacy, education, research, and information dissemination. But today I'm going to talk about advocacy because that's what I do. We're a global membership organization, as I said. We're headquartered in Houston, Texas, although we all work remotely. We have individual and institutional members, so please join us in 108 countries, many in India. At the last count, we have 12 advocacy focal points and 5 leadership development grantees in Albania, Burkina Faso, India, Colombia, and Zambia. Our membership fees are on a sliding scale that is pegged to the World Bank income classifications of countries. The majority of our members are in North America and Asia, with practitioners in the wealthier countries supporting our work to provide education and scholarships for practitioners in the lower resource countries. Our preferences for the scholarships we grant for conferences and global gatherings is for colleagues in lower and middle income countries, since they have fewer educational opportunities. You're very fortunate through Pallium India to have so many. But this presentation is on the advocacy pillar of our work, since that's what I've been doing for the last 8 years. So first of all, we're going to have a working definition of advocacy. This is just one definition of many, but it's an official published definition of public health advocacy, which is the process of gaining political commitment for a particular goal or program, which is identified by some as a critical population health strategy. So obviously, the particular goal or program we're trying to gain commitment for is palliative care services and access to palliative care medicines. And this is a critical population health strategy to relieve serious health-related suffering. But really, advocacy is just a fancy word for the process of getting the word out, or evangelization. Spreading the good news is another way I put it. Spreading that good news to patients, families, governments, health systems who could benefit from palliative care, because most people just don't know about it. So advocacy is an institutional activity. It's not individual, unlike activism, because you can be an activist without being an advocate in an international organization. And some authorities say that advocacy that physician advocacy for patients is part of your professional responsibility. Other people deny that. There's an interesting debate about whether physicians should be advocates. IHPC's advocacy shares the vision of a world free from health-related suffering with policymakers and influencers, particularly in the UN organizations. We partner with national and regional and subnational palliative care associations to help bring their work and their message up to the policymakers at the international level and to the attention of their government. So it's like a live circuit of information from different levels to each other. We join up the dots, in other words, between policymakers and providers. We try to influence global health policies, since global health itself doesn't yet have a line item or robust indicators for palliative care, and we're just getting a foot in the door. Global health's focus has always been on curing disease, and little thought has been given to attention to the millions of people whose disease cannot be cured and whose quality of life could be improved significantly with palliative care. Our advocacy at the global level supports and legitimizes the work of providers such as yourselves at the local and national levels as we educate the decision makers about the latest evidence and the international laws that protect your work. And we bring them real life stories about people who benefited from palliative care, and we persuade them to fund training and services. The desired product of our advocacy is a pallium or cover or shelter of laws, resolutions, declarations, and regulations that help to relieve serious health-related suffering and improve quality of life of patients and families. The word pallium, as I'm sure you know, comes from the Latin palliare, or to cover. So what I envision our work is a covering, our advocacy work is a covering for your work. And at the nodes, at the intersections that holds up the cover are these laws and resolutions and high-level declarations that make the cover work and protect patients and families from harm. And I think one of the most useful metaphors for this global palliative care movement that has local impact is Indra's net. And in East Asian Buddhism, Indra's net is considered as having a multifaceted jewel at each vertex. So all these are different jewels or localities, with each jewel being reflected in all the other jewels. And global palliative care advocacy creates the pearls of international laws, regulations, treaties, and political declarations, all the multilateral instruments, they're called, that produce agreed language, that's another UN term, among all the governments of the world that support palliative care and commit to integrating it into their health systems. So we're trying to cast Indra's net all over the world, so practitioners are legally authorized to prescribe controlled medicines, to be paid for the work they do, and all these different vertexes are the laws and regulations that protect your work and authorize it and hopefully eventually fund it. So another definition that's important is the 2018 consensus-based definition, which updates the World Health Organization definition from 2000 of palliative care. And the new definition is based on the concept of SHS, or serious health-related suffering. Emphasizing suffering as a mainstay of the new definition allows a shift from a disease-centered conceptualization to a more person-centered conceptualization of palliative care. The definition thus recognizes that palliative care should be delivered based on need rather than on diagnosis. My friend said, Carlos Centeno said, that palliative care is really the medicine of the future. But I also think of it as the ancient heart of medicine to relieve suffering, to cure whenever possible, of course, but always to care. And opioids that are the cornerstone medicine of palliative care originate from opium, which of course is a traditional medicine used unproblematically for thousands of years before commodification began by the East India Company and the British Empire, which really was the first drug cartel, except it was a legal, not illegal, drug cartel in the 19th century. Unavailability of controlled medicines, which is being experienced by people in about 80% of the world in our time in the 21st century, challenges your ability as professionals to carry out your ethical duties of benevolence and non-malevolence and justice. The global drug control system, when it focuses on preventing drug-related harms, just on prevention, while failing to promote a balance with the therapeutic goods, such as opioid medicines, is unjust and malevolent towards patients and providers. It undermines ethical practice at all levels of the public health system. So the concept of serious health-related suffering, just to refresh your minds about it, when it was introduced into the report of the Lancet Commission on Pain and Relief and Palliative Care, is the following. Prevention and relief of suffering is an intrinsic goal of health systems and of medicine that has been forgotten, at least until 2018, when serious health-related suffering was presented to the world as a quantitative concept. So suffering is health-related when it's associated with illness or injury of any kind. Health-related suffering is serious when it cannot be relieved without medical intervention and when it compromises physical, social, spiritual, and/or emotional functioning. SHS is most often used in the context of severe illness, and severe illness is a condition that carries a high risk of mortality. It negatively impacts quality of life and daily function, and/or is burdensome in symptoms, treatments, or caregiver stress. So that's the working definition of serious health-related suffering, which palliative care is directed at relieving. And we need to take a minute to appreciate Richard Horton's focus on the breakthrough that measuring serious health-related suffering represents. And he says measures of suffering have been absent, and so the need for palliative care and pain relief services has been easy to miss. That excuse no longer holds. The scale of human suffering is massive. The Commission has uncovered an appalling oversight in global health. It's time for that oversight to be remedied. So we're going to take a quick look now at the colonial origins of contemporary inequity in access to essential pain relief. The historical context of what is today called the narcotic drugs problem plaguing so many modern societies, a problem that includes access to medicines, actually originated in what was known as British India. The global trade in opium was legal in the British Empire. Opium profits were literally the coin of the realm. But before opium production was industrialized under the colonial system, opium was known as a traditional indigenous medicine. It was not what it's called today, which is a narcotic drug. The 19th century prohibition movement, run by missionaries and social reformers, gave it that name and worked hard to prohibit the legal trade. Their goal was to ban all cultivation, manufacture, and trade of opium except for illicit medical use. But they failed altogether. Drug trafficking is more prevalent than ever and more harmful, and only 80% of the world has no access to controlled medicines. So only in the last 2 decades, since the development of palliative medicine, has there even been public awareness raising about the crisis of untreated pain, access to medicines, and quantification of serious health-related suffering. 1.5 centuries of prohibition is the backdrop for our 2 decades of advocacy. That's why it's so slow. We're making progress towards overcoming the opioid phobia induced by the well-intentioned reform movement. And I'm going to talk about opioid phobia now, because health system weakness, lack of training, and international control system together toxically produced opioid phobia, which is literally fear of opioids. It can be reduced with correct training and good regulations that are not unduly restrictive, but prevent diversion and misuse. Professionals can now teach patients and families how they can benefit from appropriate use, but unfortunately, the drug control treaties adopted in the 20th century institutionalized opioid phobia by calling addiction an evil, and they used that word. The only time that word's ever used in an international treaty was about opioids, that has to be eliminated. So they called addiction an evil that has to be eliminated because there was no scientific addiction medicine at that time, nor was dependence disorder seen as a form of suffering as it is today. It was considered a moral evil. So strong social stigma also surrounded and still surrounds the use of opioid medications for therapeutic use. Opioid phobia can be overcome, as I said, with training and with balanced regulatory frameworks and medical education. The development of palliative medicine and the classification of medicines now have, by the WHO, has helped relieve opioid phobia, and palliative medicines now have their own chapter in the World Health Organization model list of essential medicines. So it's important to understand that palliative care medicines are both internationally controlled and essential. They're included on the WHO model list and in the schedules of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which codified all the previous opium control treaties from the 19th century. The drug control conventions list all the substances containing what are called narcotics, including morphine and codeine. They also codify cocaine, cannabis, and other substances in what are called schedules, which identify the level of control governments should subject them to, depending on a matrix of their harm to society if they're misused and their benefit if they're used properly. So there's schedules 1, 2, 3, and 4, depending on the harms. But remember, there was no such thing as palliative and addiction medicine when the Single Convention was adopted. So under one branch of international law, which is the drug control treaties, they're strictly controlled. And on another branch of international law, which is public health law, they're considered essential and they should be available in all systems at all times. So overcoming that tension in international law requires good clinical training, which you're obviously getting, administrative training for the administrators and drug regulators, and robust supply chains to ensure adequate access without diversion and non-medical use. So education, education, education. This is a graph from the International Narcotics Control Board, which shows that countries no longer consider fear of addiction, that's this line on the graph, to be the major barrier. They consider this line, which is the need for education, what countries need to be doing more to overcome barriers to essential medicines. The International Narcotics Control Board is responsible for monitoring the drug control treaties, and they frequently survey countries to find out what are the barriers to access to controlled medicines. And now they say it's lack of education. So you're contributing to the solution. The cumulative effect of all the barriers, and Smriti is going to talk about more later, is inequity, which is lack of equality depending on need. And what this map, produced by the Lancet Commission on Pain and Palliative Care, shows is distributed opioid equivalent relative to population need. So these bloated continents show that they have excess availability relative to population need, while the skinny countries show, India just about disappears, shows lack of access relative to population need. And this is all scientifically measured and quantified. Europe is considered the benchmark because it's more or less balanced, and they have good supply control and good diversion control, as well as access for palliative care. So we so often focus on the barriers, and I've been talking about that, and the negative in this discourse, but the global palliative care movement has so many assets, the main one being its people, which is you. We are a cosmopolitan movement that knows no national frontiers. Many of the palliateurs that I know give without expecting payment. They give of their time, their skills, and their energy by traveling all over the world to learn from colleagues, to teach in other countries. And collectively, we now have such a wealth of knowledge and resources and a great spirit of hope and compassion that will overcome all the barriers that we've been talking about. All the religions of the world support palliative care. We've all signed charters that are available on the Marutza Foundation website, charters of the religions of the world supporting palliative care. We have tremendous faith-based services all over the world in all countries, which are salt and light to the government, to this world that's in darkness. And since most of them need funding, these services, faith-based services, we encourage charitable giving as well as publicly funded palliative care to meet population need. So it's the private sector that requires oversight and indicators and careful watching and evaluation to make sure they also care for the most needy and don't just pursue profit margins and futile treatments at the expense of the patients. So the solution is a practical one in many ways. There's a practical solution called the Essential Package, which is produced for all countries of all income levels, which includes off-patent medications, particularly oral morphine, human resources based on competencies, not professions, and basic supplies such as adult diapers, opioid lockboxes, and catheters. The last sentence on this slide, which flags the need for political will to fund the essential package and provide the fraction of the health budget needed for morphine, requires advocacy, a form of citizenship that holds governments accountable for the commitments they've made in the international system. And I was encouraged to learn that as Indian citizens, you're obliged to advocate for reform in your health systems, as we see in Article 51 of your Constitution. Because it says it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to develop the scientific temper, humanism, and spirit of inquiry and reform, which is great. I wish every constitution said that and encouraged people to be advocates for health system reform. Article 47 is a bit more problematic, but you can turn it to your advantage as advocates by reading it positively, because it's actually a double negative, but it can be translated as, quote, the state's primary duty shall be to ensure the consumption of drugs. I don't like that word because it's ambiguous. It would be an interesting public campaign to propose more affirmative and balanced language here. But you've got this except for medical purposes. So you can make the case for medicinal purposes, which are therapeutic for health. So I have to leave it here. A quick takeaway being that the opioid phobia here it comes. Okay, the opioid phobia in weak health systems and regulatory systems where there's insufficient professional training in opioid prescribing produces inequity that we saw in the map, that global map. So the fix, of course, is to apply advocacy and strengthen public health systems, educate, and include palliative care training in undergraduate curriculums and continuing education. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your attention today. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the content, while for others it may have been new. I encourage you to join IHPC. Here's the link for that. So you can take my advocacy course as well as the clinical training courses we have for our members. And I'm going to leave you with this reflection from Rabindranath Tagore, which says, as you can read, that death is not extinguishing the light. It's only putting out the lamp because the dawn has come. And we serve in this hope. And all the palliative care providers I know and have tremendous faith in life, in the whole process of life and death and dying and bereavement. It's wonderful that you've joined the global palliative care movement and are committed to learning. So congratulations and thank you again for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Katherine. So you even took the trouble to record this session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry I couldn't do it live.
So would you be around till the end of the session, or do you want to leave early? I heard that you have
No, I have another meeting in about just over an hour, but I can definitely hang out for the next hour. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So then we will invite Smriti for the next session. Smriti, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katherine. Always wonderful to listen to you. I'm really glad to be able to lately work more closely with Katherine as an India advocacy focal point. And I can tell you that signing up for those advocacy classes is going to be absolutely great. So I strongly recommend that those of you who haven't looked it up yet, please do so. Okay, so I'm going to bring it I'm going to bring it home to India. All of these things that Katherine talked about. I have often been asked, what is the importance of advocacy when it comes to providing palliative care, service delivery in a country like India. And I'd like for us all to think about it as we exist within an ecosystem. And if the ecosystem is not enabling, then our struggles as individual organizations and institutions and practitioners is going to be sabotaged and threatened at every step. You can go and study as much as you want. You can go and, your passion can take you a very long distance. But if your ecosystem is not an enabling one, then it's just going to be that much more difficult. And in a sense, I will also say that every single one of us, whether we admit it or not, we are advocates, because if you talk about palliative care to one other person, you're already doing advocacy for the cause. So I'm going to be talking to you more about the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act and how it affects us in our practice, a little bit about the background and what the current status in our country is. And the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act has been in the news a lot in the last few years for all the wrong reasons. People will have you believe that it is more about control. It is about stopping misuse and diversion. It's about stopping traffickers and people who are illicitly consuming drugs. Please understand that your practice as palliative care physicians is strongly linked to the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. And there is another side to this law that all of us need to be very aware of. So I'm just going to share my slides. I will take a minute to say thank you to Tripti Tandon, who is a lawyer. She's the one who has been absolutely vital in the process of law reform and drug policy reform in our country, without whose legal advice we would really not have been able to get through this labyrinth of a maze. And a lot of this information on the slides I'm going to present to you are from Tripti. And so you will find that there's a lot of legal language in it, which we have tried to really sort of simplify for our benefit. So here it is. Okay, I just call it the story of NDPS, but it is really a process and a journey. And to me, it has been a remarkable story with lessons all along the way on what advocacy really looks like when it comes to enabling access to medicines for pain relief or for any sort of law reform, really. So Katherine told us about the colonial roots and the international treaties and the international conventions. I mean, this is what it typically looks like. I'm not going to really go into it, but in our country, the central government has the power to add or remove substances from the list of controlled substances, manufactured drugs and psychotropic substances. Okay, so we won't waste too much time on this slide. So we know the thing is that if you go back to the international conventions, like Katherine talked about, we really, as member states, have a dual responsibility. And I'm going to specifically speak through the lens of pain relief. Yes, we have a responsibility to prevent the misuse of opioids, but we also have to make sure that opioids are available for those who are in pain. And this is a very delicate balance. And they really draw from this balance, where public health rests, and it's international laws of criminal justice, which really look into prevention of diversion for illicit use, and international laws of human rights, which say that there has to be medicines and drugs available for medical and scientific purposes. And it's a pinprick of a balance that this is resting on. Unfortunately, the diagram is skewed to the left. It's much heavier on the left. It is all about control. It's all about prevention and restrictive measures rather than making things more accessible. And of course, we agree that that aspect is important, but surely it should not completely outweigh access to medicines. The NDPS Act, so India signed a bunch of international agreements that required it to bring in some controls and regulations. And the NDPS Act is really a mixture of British colonial law and international agreements. And this is what it has resulted in. I'll also say that, this goes back to the war on drugs approach that came out of America in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And as a result, many countries had this knee-jerk reaction and came up with highly restrictive, prohibitive laws. And the NDPS Act is one of them. And it had a terribly negative effect on the availability of morphine in India for medical purpose. And it became the barrier to access. Okay. Now, consumption of morphine as a result of the NDPS Act from 1985 to 1997 fell a whopping 97%, from 716 kilograms to 18 kilograms. And that means that the pain burden of the country went up that much. So we need to look at it from the lens of what it did to people who are already in pain. Now, what's the relationship of the NDPS with palliative care? Pain relief is a major aspect of palliative care. access to medicines is needed for pain relief. Medicines for pain relief are covered under the NDPS and are largely were under restrictive provisions. And this was an issue that was identified by doctors. It was really identified by doctors who were really frustrated at seeing their patients suffer despite the availability of medicines like opioids to treat pain. I will highlight here, available does not mean accessible. Something can be available, it is not accessible automatically. Okay, so the NDPS Act, it has all these different classifications. It had all these classifications. It had narcotic drugs, which were basically plant-based, things like cannabis, coca, opium poppy, opium and its product. It also had a subcategory of manufactured drugs. And this came from a more colonial sort of framework. It had psychotropic substances, and it had these are just it had things like tramadol and ketamine, which have medicinal purpose, but it also had others which were considered purely recreational and illicit. Controlled substances basically refers to any chemical that is used for the manufacture of a narcotic or a psychotropic substance. Now, the problem also with the NDPS Act was that it had several overlapping categories. Opioids were defined under opium derivative, which, by the way, heroin is also an opium derivative. There was manufactured drug, preparation containing any manufactured drug, narcotic drug. It was a complete mess of overlapping jargon. And there was a division of regulatory power, division of activities under various regulatory powers. So when it came to the drugs themselves, the activities around the drugs, and the authorities that had to be reported to, it had all kinds of divisions. And for example, for the psychotropic substances, rule-making power was vested in the central government. For manufactured drugs, rule-making power was with the central government, but and rules for possession, transport, sale, etc. was with the state government. So it was a huge hodgepodge of who was in charge of what. And like I said, multiple activities, possession, sale, manufacture, these are activities. Multiple licenses required for these activities and multiple agencies involved. And it was not at all homogeneous. Every state had its own quirk. Now, for example, in Goa, for a patient to get access to pain relief, they had to personally present the prescription to the collector, to the district collector. And only when the district collector said, okay, they could go to the pharmacy. I mean, somebody who's in that level of pain is not going to be able to do that. There was inconsistency, like I said, between states. In UP, it was the excise department that was responsible. In Kerala, it was the state drug controller. So various states had various people in charge. And there were rules for import interstate and export interstate. If I had to get the drug from, say, Rajasthan or Maharashtra or UP or wherever it was manufactured, I needed something akin to an export-import license. And in some cases, in some states, there were just no rules. So if there's no rules, that means there's not even a maze that you can try and navigate. The door is just shut. There's no access. So all of these things put together made it absolutely impossible to realistically access medicines for pain relief in a timely way, in a compassionate way, in a competent way. Like I said, it was a maze. But having said that, in 2001, the Lancet had published this study. 1,723 patients had been studied and followed in Kerala. And there was a system for documentation for each of these patients who was issued morphine or another opioid. It was very carefully documented. And later on, this documentation was also studied. And they found that there were no major unaccounted discrepancies. It was all accounted for. Even the discrepancies were accounted for. And when those discrepancies were investigated, the end result was that they found that there was no misuse or diversion. If at all there was a discrepancy, it might be a minor clerical error, but there was actually no misuse or diversion in that sense. So that shows that over a period of 2 years, it was absolutely safe use of opioids in the state of Kerala. Now, this is an important study because it provided evidence for good practice later. And that is something that we all need to be paying attention to, because for advocacy to be really effective, we need to document good practice. We cannot just go and be activists about it and say pain relief for everybody. We have to make it a point to demonstrate that it can be done safely, rationally, and we are not pushing for, irrational use of these medicines. Now, so the NDPS Act was a mess, and it proved, like I said, to be the biggest barrier to pain relief in the country. And so people started to recognize this, and efforts to change began. And what did advocacy look like? At the policy level, and by the way, India is the only country where opioids come under the Department of Revenue and not under the Department of Health. And this is a hangover from the East India Company, because at the time, opium was a trade commodity. And therefore, it has stayed under the Finance Ministry, under the Department of Revenue. So in 1998, simplified model rules were recommended by the Department of Revenue to the states, and said, you all have to simplify your rules a little bit. And this required working with individual states, which you can imagine was a very, very uphill task. There was also a litigation in the Delhi High Court. A public interest litigation was filed by, I think, the caregiver of a cancer patient, demanding that this patient be given access to pain relief as soon as possible. And this went on to the Supreme Court of India. And from the point, so this was all process-based, but then it finally, this light bulb which came on saying, actually, the problem is with the law, and the law is the thing that has to be reformed, was explored only in 2012. And for the first time, an NDPS amendment bill was introduced in the parliament in 2011, and that actually hadn't had any provisions for medical access. So suddenly we realized that the problem with the lack of access is actually the law, and it is a law that needs to be reformed. So there was no language around provision for medical access till 2011. Now, what were the principles that guided advocates at this point? There were lawyers involved, there were civil society professionals, civil society advocates, professionals, doctors, caregivers, a whole bunch of people came together, and these were the guiding principles. Not only is the medical use of opioids permitted, but it is indispensable for health. And this is something that is globally known. It is required for pain relief. It is required for the alleviation of breathlessness. It is not just something that we use as an add-on. It is actually indispensable. The principle of balance, which is enshrined in the single convention, we have to implement it. And that is to ensure medical use while preventing misuse. Yes, we acknowledge that the NDPS Act allows, because people were saying there is a provision for it. But if you need 6 licenses renewable every year, valid at the same time, you know that that's not going to happen. It is procedurally impossible. And so while the provisions are there, they are very, very contradictory provisions and very, very difficult provisions. So it allows yet frustrates. And a very poignant argument that was made was, India was one of the largest manufacturers of legal, raw material for opioids in the world, but we were exporting most of it. Less than I think at that time, 0.04% of us had access to it. So the fact that our own people were dying in pain while we were exporting it was also an argument that was presented. And then here's where the evidence from Kerala came in, saying it is actually possible to prescribe and stock, dispense, and use prescribed morphine and other opioids safely, and Kerala has demonstrated it. So that was the thinking behind it. The process behind it was that we had to engage with various people at the top level. So with a parliamentary standing committee, we had to push for a parliamentary standing committee to be formed. We had to engage with them. We had to engage with the Department of Revenue, the Ministry of Finance. Constant meetings were had, submissions were made. It was the legal team, Tripti Tandon and her colleagues, who helped us draft the legislative amendments. It's one thing to ask for change, but you need legal language to say how that change, what that change should look like, so that we safely get our point across. And so they really helped us with the drafting the suggested and recommended amendments. We had to advocate with the media. We had to really get this, you know, the story out, and advocacy with members of parliament. So there was a point where members of parliament were flooded by letters from patients, survivors, caregivers. And these were very, very strong, potent stories saying, you know, my loved one died in so much pain. I didn't have access to pain relief. This is available. And so a lot of caregivers, survivors, and patients wrote in to members of parliament, to a point where the members of parliament could no longer ignore it. And this is just a little, you know, summation of what that advocacy looked like on paper. And finally, all this advocacy, after 19 years of from when it was first identified as a problem, and when it first came into the change, the NDPS was amended in 2014. And I will never forget this day. I had a parent who had died from cancer and excruciating pain in the year 2000. And I remember at that time thinking that, you know, I would prefer her to just die rather than to experience this kind of pain. 14 years later, when this law was amended, when we got that call, it was the last bill to be passed by the Congress government ever in the history of its governance. And it happened at just as the supplementary sessions were closing. It was a very dramatic moment, but it was a very, very powerful moment. And I remember many of us got very emotional about it. So it was adopted by the parliament in February 2014. It was agreed to by the President of India in March 2014 and came into force on the 1st of May 2014. It was actually recognized at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna as a historic achievement, and it actually recognized the role of civil society advocates, where it says such amendments were drafted with the active participation of civil society and the palliative care community. I think it was the first time in its history that the CND had acknowledged the role of civil society actors in the palliative care community in the changing of a law in a country. Sorry, I'm just going to be mindful of time. Okay. Now, what were the key changes? What were these amendments? For the first time, the NDPS talked about the fact that the law had to be broadened in order to promote medical and scientific use of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. It recognized that there was a medical and scientific component to these substances. It created a new category called essential narcotic drugs, which we called ENDS. Which only the central government can notify. The central government can transfer and what happened was, sorry, that's the third point. It's not part of the second point. Transfer of rule-making power for possession, transport, purchase, sale, import, interstate, export, interstate, use and consumption of ENDs was transferred from the state government to the central government. So now states couldn't come up with their own rules. Everything was defined centrally, and that was a huge step in standardizing the process across the country. So that thing about different in Goa, different in Kerala, different in Maharashtra, all of that stopped. Everything went to the central government, which standardized the whole process. Now, the word essential is very important because essential narcotic drugs, because it conveys that there's a purpose. It is essential for a purpose, okay? And the central government does not need to amend the NDPS in order to notify medication or drugs under the essential narcotic drugs list. It has confirmed that the medical community's opinion is absolutely essential when notifying these drugs under the essential narcotic drugs list. And like I said, ENDS will be subjected to uniform rules throughout the country, but very, very importantly, penalties for illicit use will remain unchanged. So if anyone is found misusing it or diverting it, the penalties will remain as harsh. And that was something that was agreed to by all parties at the time. So as of today, these are the essential narcotic drugs that have been notified: codeine, fentanyl, hydrocodone, methadone. morphine and all preparations. The last two drugs are not, Dr. Sunil, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're not available in India, but they're not. So but they're on the list. So there could be a little bit of a, corporate capture element to that, that drugs that are not available in India are still on the essential narcotic drugs list. But as of now, all these other medicines are there and essential to palliative care. Now, I want to just talk about the difference between Act and the rules. Rules are what operationalize a law. So you have the law. How do you make that law a reality? It's through the rules. Now, I'll take questions at the end if that's okay, Dr. Sunil.
Yes.
Okay. To operationalize availability and access to ends, and the NDPS rules were really influenced by the Kerala model because, like, again, the Kerala model had demonstrated ways in which this could be done. And especially the idea of the RMI, the recognized medical institution, and who should be the authority, licensing authority, the state drug controller. These are two things that came out of Kerala's model and was adopted at the central level. Not to say that the NDPS is perfect now. We have a long way to go. There's still quite a few amendments that are needed. And there are some problematic aspects that need fixing. And we continue to advocate for those changes. But this was a huge step forward. So at a glance, what is the old procedure and new procedure difference? Earlier, under the NDPS, you needed multiple licenses, renewable every year, valid at the same time. Today, you only need one license, which is the RMI certificate. Okay, the recognized medical institution. Earlier, there were multiple agencies involved. Today, you have a single agency, the drug controller, the state drug controller. That is it. There's no excise involved, even though some people still say that excise gets involved. That's not, it's illegal if they're getting involved. Earlier, the licenses were only valid for a year at a time, which made it impossible to have all 5-6 licenses going at the same time. Today, the RMI certificate is for 3 years and it can be renewed. Earlier, there were different procedures in different states. Today, you have uniform rules for all states and union territories. I'm just going to quickly, I'm going to move past that. Okay, who can possess ENDs? A patient can for their own use. Quantities sold or dispensed at one time is defined. A registered medical practitioner within quantity limits for use in his practice or his or her practice, it's Women's Day, come on, which excludes sale or distribution. That's only within your own practice. Morphine up to 500 mg, direct administration to patient under RMP's care. If you're exceeding the quantity limits, it has to be done with the authorization of the state drug controller. You can get this for 3 years. Okay. Any person authorized by the state drug controller by special or general order can possess ENDs. An RMI can possess ENDs, and licensed dealer or a chemist where the quantity is specified in the license issued by the state government under the state NDPS rules overseen by the drug controller. Okay. Who else can possess? Educational or scientific institute authorized by the state drug controller, the pilot or the captain of an aircraft or ship for emergency use, again, specified quantity and order, person in charge of an ambulance. Who can buy from a drug manufacturer? A licensed chemist or a dealer, a registered medical practitioner, a person authorized by the drug controller, a recognized medical institution. Who can sell to patients? A licensed dealer or chemist on prescription, and recognized medical institution. So let's just talk a little bit more about a recognized medical institution. Any institution can apply for this recognition. The form is available, form number 3F. In fact, Pallium India has an entire toolkit of the entire SOPs, protocols, and the forms. So if any of you need it, we're happy to share the entire toolkit, the whole docket with you. So everything that I'm going to be talking about, it's all available in that docket. Ideally, the rules say that you will be granted it within 60 days of date application if you meet the criteria. The validity is 3 years, after which you have to renew it. And recognition can be suspended or cancelled, and both of these are appealable. And government hospitals with at least one trained RMP do not have to apply for the RMI. It is it's a naturally granted RMI. It is, you don't need to apply for it. However, there are other provisions of record keeping, filing, returns, etc., which whether you're a government institute or a private practice, you have to go by those same rules when it comes to documentation, record keeping, filing, returns, and so on. And a recognized medical institute has to have a designated medical practitioner as the in charge, the person who handles this. Quantity limits as per estimate or revised estimate submitted to drug controller. So you have to let them know, what is your estimate that you're going to be using, and those are the quantity limits that will be defined. You have to maintain a daily record of stock, and patients have to be registered. They have to be registered before you can cut a prescription to them, and a separate form has to be maintained for each patient. You have to file an annual return, which gives all the details of stocks, prescriptions, etc. And each of your records have to be preserved for a minimum, have to be preserved for 2 years. They cannot be destroyed before 2 years. Inspection by the state drug controller or officer, or an officer authorized by him. Okay, you will be subjected to those inspections, and disposal of expired drugs have to be done in the presence of the officer. Under these rules, home care treatment is permitted. The important thing is that the patient must be registered with a recognized medical institute. The designated medical practitioner in charge has to nominate a qualified person to carry that quantity needed for the patient to the patient. So it could be a nurse, it could be, whatever, members of the home care team. The END has to be given to the patient at home in the place of stay. It cannot be given to a neighbor's house. It cannot be given to a relative's house. It has to be given to where the place of stay or the address of the patient is recognized in government records. And designated medical practitioners in charge to have to maintain a record of used and unused drug in home care. Okay. There's no restriction or special requirement for interstate or export or import. You can carry it across states. You don't have to be, you don't have to have a special license for it now. Procurement is through a consignment note. All those details are there in the docket. I know this doesn't happen, but unused ENDs to be returned by the patient to the registered medical institution, who will treat it as a receipt. It is not always possible to do this, although it is advised as best practice, because when a patient dies and they no longer have use for the morphine, following up with the family to get that stock back could be very, very difficult. So also we have to exercise wisdom in the way it is prescribed. If they are close enough to collect the medication once in 2 weeks, then that's the amount that can be prescribed. And I'm sure Dr. Sunil can talk about it some more. And ends cannot be transferred, loaned, or sold to other institutions. It cannot be transferred, sold, or loaned to other institutions. It has to only go through yours as per all these rules and regulations that I just talked about. I'm going to quickly try and wrap up. The prescription has to be issued by an RMP, and that person has to be trained in pain relief and palliative care or opioid substitution therapy. It has to be in writing with date and signature, the full name, address, and registration number of the RMP, name and address of the patient, daily dose, and period of consumption. All of these details have to be in the prescription. Okay, I'm going to skip this. This is just to show the level where we're at right now. As of 2023, January, 25 states have adopted the amended rules. Whether they've put it into practice is still, it varies very, very drastically from state to state. 21 states have responded to the Department of Revenue with lists of RMIs. So the Department of Revenue wrote to all the states and said, tell us how many RMI licenses have been issued in your state. Only 21 states have responded. Only 13 of those 21 have said this is our final list. The rest don't know if there are more or not. There are a total of, as of today, what we know, recorded with the RMI, with the DOR, there are 856 RMIs across these 21 states that have reported back, of which more than 400 are in Kerala. And this information that we have is a result of 1 year of rigorous, continuous follow-ups with the Department of Revenue and the Drug Controller General of India. And it has been a constant effort to work with them to get this information, because we really don't know what the outcome of the NDPS amendments are unless we have all of this information. I'm just going to stop with these 2 slides. I'm sure you've seen them somewhere before. This was a patient who was in this position for 3 weeks because of the pain he was in before he received morphine. 3 rupees worth of medicines, or immediate release oral morphine, enabled him to sit up and have a cup of tea. So let's not get caught up in all the numbers and statistics and the legalities and the laws. Let's remember the stories of the patients that we serve. If this is what access to immediate release oral morphine can do, then why are we not fighting for it more? And I'm going to leave you with this last slide, which is historically, we've talked about harm versus value, control versus access. We have to restrict, we have to stop, we have to bring in law enforcement. We cannot let people have access to it. And there are people fighting for access. And it is seen as a fight between restrictive and enabling rules. But balance is really in the center. Who is the patient who is suffering? Is it someone with substance use disorder? Is it somebody with cancer or with acute pain or breathlessness? And really our focus as practitioners, like Katherine has also talked about, should be on the focus of the suffering of the individuals and the families, whichever side you are treating, whoever your patient is. We have to focus on safe access through high quality data on opioid use outcomes. So please document good practice. Please keep documenting good practice. We have to build the evidence for it. And we have to focus on a partnership between governments, professionals, and civil society. None of us are going to do this on our own. We cannot expect the government to do it. We cannot expect only the professionals to take on this clarion call. Every single one of us has a role to play in this advocacy. And the best models of care that you see today, whether they're in Uganda or India, in other low and middle income countries, Kerala, Telangana, there's one common denominator underscoring all these successes, that there has been a partnership between governments, professionals, and civil society. So we need a big tent, which we all need to get under and work towards. I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Smriti. And let's open the session for discussion. Yes, Dr. Parul.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful session. I have 2 queries. The first one I want to ask the Smriti ma'am. I have a query. If I am registered in one state and now I want to move to the another state, will I have to apply for my RMP once again in that state, or I can work with my previous state's RMP?
Dr. Sunil, I think you're in a better position to answer that.
Yeah, but each state, we need, if we want to practice, we should have the corresponding state medical council registration. So you have to register with the state drug controller also. You will not be able to transfer the RMI from one state to another.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. My another query is for Katherine, ma'am. Ma'am, in your one of the slides, you mentioned about the suffering, that there is no tool still present where we can measure the suffering. And I believe the suffering is quite personal and it varies from person to person. Do we have still any tool where we can assess suffering? Because for someone it might be the money, and for some other it might not. It might be the no caregiver. So how do we measure that?
That's a very interesting question. I'm sorry if I didn't mean to say we can't measure suffering. I think the whole point of what I was trying to say, so it's my bad if I didn't communicate it properly, was that now with the Lancet Commission report, they're measuring suffering related to the need for opioids, which, as you know, as you just said, is different from, say, spiritual or financial suffering. That's a very interesting question, is how we would have a comprehensive tool to measure suffering. There's certainly tools to measure. Now, that may be the wrong word, and this is not my field of expertise, but the spiritual care professionals have tools to, let me think of if I can think of the right word, to do spiritual suffering evaluations. If anyone else knows about this, you should speak up. So there are tools to measure spiritual suffering. I think you just have to Google that or look it up, or Christina Pachowski is like the lead person globally on that. Financial, I'm not sure that would be difficult if you could certainly document spiritual suffering, but to be really clear on the SHS, which I referred to in my presentation, the serious health related suffering, that has to do with population level access to opioids. So the Lancet Commission, health economists and doctors who were present, they had a matrix that they worked with, and Dr. Raj was involved in that commission, about the different conditions which cause suffering. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was like 20 some conditions, including injuries, dementia, nausea. In fact, they're still refining that list of conditions that cause suffering. And then they have records, because the International Narcotics Control Board keeps records of each country's consumption. That's part of the whole control system, that everyone has to report how much opioids they've consumed. So then they create this matrix of knowing whether there's suffering related to a certain health condition. Now, that's what they measure at a population level. But at a patient and household level, I'm sure there are other instruments. But me not being a clinician, I'm a policy and legal person, I can't answer that from a bedside perspective. I'm sorry.
Got it, ma'am. Sunil sir, do you have anything to say regarding this, with their experience?
Were you talking about SHS? How to quantify?
Yeah.
So I think that's still in the evaluation stage. And if you remember, in the previous session, Rajagopal sir showed us how to screen an SHS, and once these are all evolving. And actually, I'm not sure whether there are any other tools to measure the suffering as such, as per SHS. Because it is a newer concept, and people are behind that to how to quantify, etc. So I think it might take some time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am, so much.
Dr. Kavin Kumar?
Well, you could develop that tool. That would be very helpful.
Hello, sir. Ma'am, thank you for all the wonderful efforts made for the amendment of NDPS Act with a lot of challenges and barriers. So, in the presentation of Smriti ma'am has mentioned about the research, the evidence creation, which has helped a lot in the reforming those barriers in the NDPS Act. So, post NDPS amendment from 2015, I would like to ask ma'am, like, what are the barriers left out after the post amendment? So what are the areas for implementation research in that focus? So thank you.
The biggest barrier is that there's lack of awareness that the NDPS rules have changed. And that lack of awareness goes right up to the state drug controllers. A lot of our work as Pallium India's state facilitation teams and stuff is to actually conduct opioid availability workshops in different states of India, where we invite different stakeholders, from the drug controllers to the doctors to hospital administrators to excise people, to say, did you know that this law has been amended? And a shocking number of them do not know that it has been amended. Our biggest barrier is also that professionals and institutions are not applying for the RMI license because some excise officer is saying that, no, you have to come through me. And we've done this in a couple of states. We continue in our capacity as a WHO collaborating center for training and policy on access to pain relief. We've had to write to state drug controllers and say, just to bring to your attention that these are the new laws and you have to issue an RMI to this institution. You are actually in violation of the law if you don't do it. And there is no room for the excise officer. So these are the barriers, Dr. Kavan Kumar, that the bureaucracy doesn't know about it. And, you know, like I said, we had to push for over a year to get the Department of Revenue to get this information from different states. And only 21 states have bothered to reply. So there's a deep systemic issue here. Now, Katherine also talked about the fact that, you know, consumption of morphine is essential data for the INC, for the International Narcotics Control Board. It was recognized that in India we don't have accurate data, so we use distribution data in India. But how do we even know distribution data if we don't know how many RMIs there are in the country? So this is where our barriers are. There is barriers to access because of lack of awareness on every level: professionals, doctors, medical fraternity, policymakers, legislators, law enforcement people. And I would say once we come together on that issue, then we can present a much more unified front to bring in these other amendments that we need. We also have a concern at the moment that under certain clauses in the NDPS, there is no distinction made between a healthcare provider and everybody else when it comes to illicit use. So, you know, we've been sort of working behind the scenes to ensure that there is a distinction made at every level of this act, where the healthcare provider is distinguished from a civilian or a lay person, because there has to be some protective measure in this sense, where, you know, you can't immediately have this person put in jail for 10 years without due diligence from the state drug controller, etc., the license issuing authority, and so on. So efforts are on to make sure that those distinctions are in place. But I would say the more immediate concern is that nobody knows that what the rules are now anymore. And there are people who always take advantage of that lack of knowledge. For example, you'll have an inspector, drug inspector, coming and telling you that he also has a role to play in the whole thing, which he doesn't really. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, ma'am. One more thing is, like, how does this open up the arenas for research in the, especially in the implementation research? So can we do some at the grassroots level, not at the policymaker level, maybe at the grassroots level? How can this be carry forward, or kind of to represent this barriers?
I would invite you right now, Dr. Kavan Kumar, to sign up with me for let's do a study across the country from the frontline providers' point of view, because we did a study which has just now been published by the WHO on barriers to access to pain relief in South Asia. And you'll find that a lot of the issues, and we interviewed only doctors and frontline providers, and a lot of the issues are universal. You know, issues with supply chain, issues with your authorities not knowing what you are allowed to do, your own administration not allowing you to prescribe morphine even if you've been trained in it. So this grassroots level information, we can come up with a way to find out what are the ways in which you are experiencing these barriers at a very practical level, so that can inform decisions higher up. Katherine, would you like to come in a little bit on this as well?
Well, what I was just going to ask you is, because he mentioned grassroots, is India still a newspaper reading and radio listening community? People don't read newspapers and listen to the radio so much, because getting the press involved, the local newspapers, if you have them, is helpful. Doing a media campaign, because often these bureaucrats, and I'm not talking specifically about India, but they can inform people with human interest stories about that kind of thing. I know in Kenya, they've been very successful with that. Dr. Zippy's been very successful raising awareness through newspapers, but that's because in Kenya, a lot of people still read newspapers. So it depends on your context. What's a good instrument of communication?
Social media would be also very, I mean, even most people even read their newspapers on social media now. Yeah, but we do, I'm happy to have a longer conversation with you, Dr. Kavan Kumar, about this, because definitely there are areas that we need to highlight through grassroots practice. And not, it's really important. And Katherine is the expert in the world about this. The integration of palliative care, the primary health level is so important. And so we can have a much longer conversation about that at another time. Thank you for that question. It's a very important one.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
I have one comment to make regarding the suffering which Parul had brought up. I think as clinicians, we have to look at the situation and the patients and the scenarios one after the other. I mean, you can't try to categorize and create an algorithm or a tool where everything fits, one size fits for all. As clinicians, I think we have to look at the situation. For example, today I went and saw a person who was in terminal stages and he had death rattle. He was unaware of it, as in most of the times, but it was the daughter and the relatives who were suffering because of the noise. And then I had to convince them that it was actually not the patient who was suffering, it is because of the way that noise is made, you feel that he is suffering. So I could control it with the glycopyrrolate, and then they were also happy. So what I mean to say is that suffering is not just only for the patients, it can also be for the relatives. So how will you categorize everything into an algorithm or a tool? Because the situations are different as it comes. So as clinicians who are there looking after the patients, they are the ones who have to analyze the situation, analyze the patient, analyze the environment, and also the people around with them, and deal with it accordingly as it comes, as which is most appropriate. And you can't rely on algorithms or tools for that, because it will be so vast and so complex that it will just fall apart. So as doctors, I think we have to make the call, and we have to make the decisions whether the suffering is there, and if it is there, how it can be mitigated and how it can be minimized or taken care of, as rightfully said in the definition of palliative care. That's what we are there for. So we can't keep on inventing true tools, and it is not going to work actually. In reality, it is not. I don't think it is going to work. I mean, we are in the age of computerization, but everything cannot be computerized. That's what I feel. That's my take on that.
Thank you, Dr. Bijo, for your comments. Let me take you to another situation. In a medical college, where one doctor see, or even in a primary health center, one doctor see how many patients? 300 patients in 4 hours. And he doesn't have time to see the suffering. So maybe if there is something, screening tool, which will give the doctor an idea that this patient has serious health-related suffering. So he then would be able to give more time to attend to the suffering of that patient. So that might be one of the advantage of having a tool. Otherwise, as you told, suffering, we cannot quantify all the suffering. How can we?
No, I was talking in terms of palliative care, sir. I mean, not in terms of other specialities. As you said, of course, in the OPD, we'll be seeing about 200, 300 patients. So it's impossible to assess it without deeper involvement and, talking with the patients as well as the relatives. You're absolutely right. I was talking in terms of the palliative care, which we are doing. That's what I was talking.
Anybody else? So, Katherine, I would like to hear from you. What are the major milestones we have achieved through advocacy for palliative care?
Thank you for that question. I realize I should have covered that, but 25 minutes goes by really quickly, or 35. The main ones that we've been able to achieve, I think I could start with 2014. That's the World Health Assembly resolution. 6719 is the number, WHA 6719. And it's the resolution that was passed by the World Health Assembly unanimously. And all countries at the World Health Assembly committed to integrating palliative care into their health systems, progressing towards universal health coverage, allowing access and availability of controlled medicines, and all the things we want. So that was 10 years ago. Next year is going to be the anniversary of that. 2016 was the approval of the UN General Assembly special session on the world drug problem, where the final report of that has a whole chapter with 7 operational paragraphs on how countries can, because it's directed at governments, how governments can improve access to controlled medicines. The main recommendation being, of course, education, as I said in my presentation, of providers. But I recommend you look at that. All those resources are on our website, available on our advocacy page. 2018, so we're going every 2 years here, is the Declaration of Astana, which updated the Alma Ata Declaration from 1978 on primary health care, and requested that, committed that palliative care is part of primary health care. And then 2019, the high-level declaration on universal health coverage, which includes palliative care in the essential services that should be covered by all countries, universal health coverage. So those are 5 big wins we've had. And then last year, 2022, I think it was 2022, or December of 2021, the Human Rights Council approved a resolution on the rights of older people that directs countries to make sure that palliative care is available for older people. So those are all the global milestones we've been able to accomplish just in the last 9 years, which isn't too bad. Because as I said, we've got 6 decades or more, a century really, of the control. So slowly but surely, it's much slower than the patients need, but international law moves slowly. And as Smriti's saying, even the uptake and awareness at the local level takes forever. So we all have a part to play.
Anybody else has any more questions?
Madam Katherine, I would like to make another comment with regard to the advocacy which we are talking about. In Kerala, because I work in Kerala and I'm in Kochi, and I work both in the government as well as in the private side. Right now, I'm in the private tertiary level hospital. What I have noticed is that while we were going for palliative care, home care from the government side, you're absolutely true. We have a fantastic network of of care. Through the primary health centers, through the district level hospitals, panchayat levels, everything. It's very beautifully organized and very beautifully done by very dedicated people. But the problem there is that this is mostly advocated to the poor sections of the community. Though the medium, what I mean to say is the what you call the middle income group and the higher middle income group, which are not the exclusively high rich people, I'm talking about the middle, which is the mass of people. They are unaware of this kind of practice, and at the same time, they feel that it is like there's a stigma attached to it that, okay, if they call those palliative people, then what will be the neighbors comment, because they will think that their parents are being not cared for in the hospitals, they are being cared for in the houses. This is one practical thing which I have seen practically in Kerala. And secondly, they would like them to be admitted to the private hospitals, but in the hospice or palliative care. But they are not aware that, you know, the private hospitals also have started palliative care, like in my hospital. And there is a sizable population in the middle income group who are actually suffering because of this. They don't know that such a care exists in the hospital, in the private side, where they can call us anytime, and we will give them the same quality of care which they should be given as by the government people for the poor people. So this is something which now we are advocating. We are slowly spreading from our side, whatever we can do by word of the mouth. Now we are going to the press. What we did now is that we are calling almost 1,500 residents association in Ernakulam, where I'm practicing, and asking their representatives to come and meet us and listen to us and become aware of what we are actually doing for the people, so that they can go to the grassroots level and go to the residents association where there are 10, 15, 20, 30 houses, and by word of mouth, give that information, so that anybody who needs that kind of care can call us without any stigma attached to it. So it's slowly taking place now here.
I'd like to just respond to that. I thank you for bringing this up, because this is a perception and optics issue.
Yes.
And in most low and middle income countries, you think that palliative care is a charity service.
Yes.
And if I'm going to give my parents good quality care, it can't be for free. Surely there is some lack in it. Now, that's one. The second is, paradoxically in our countries, I mean, now, Dr. Biju, your hospital, I'm really glad to hear that yours has a palliative care department. But for a very long time, private hospitals did not have palliative care teams. And my friend, Dr. Roop Gursahani says, you know, and he's a neurologist at Hinduja, he says, modern day hospitals are like fortresses. The poor can't get in, the rich can't get out. And I cannot tell you how many times families have gotten in touch with me from different parts of the country saying, I'm in excruciating pain. These are calls from Bombay, Delhi, Pune. And I refer them back to a palliative care team. And it turns out that the palliative care team is in the same hospital, and the attending doctor has not referred them to the palliative care team. So there is an internal system that is problematic in the hospital. There's a referrals problem within the medical fraternity. And of course, there is this perception that palliative care is a charitable service, which no, self-respecting person is going to opt for if that's going to look like. Yeah.
Madam, one more thing is there, as you brought this thing up, actually the senior consultants and specialists in other specialties other than oncology, they are not aware that, their patients can be given palliative care. Like, advanced cardiac failure patients who have passed the age of, say, cardiac transplant or a cardiac liver and lung transplant. They are in end-stage organ failure anyway, and so nothing more can be done except getting them, admitted repeatedly to the ICU, and then give them a little bit of reprieve, go back home, and then coming back again to the ICU maybe 3 times a month. And even the doctors don't know what to do, and they don't know what to tell the patients. That's where we can come in and help them. And I have helped them, quite a few of those consultants, once they came to know that they can rely upon us to handle it well. So I told them, try to involve us at least halfway through the patient when you know that the person is declining and is going to a point of no return. Then, the patients also will trust us, and the bystanders and the caregivers who are the actual relatives of the patients also will come to know us. And once they're taken home, it is not as if that the doctors are giving up on them, but it's like a transition. We are taking them back home and then treating them in their house, in a very beautiful setup, and they're given the same care. They're given the same treatment. And that's what we advocate. That's what I'm trying to do, trying to convince all my consultants very, very subtly, very slowly, because, you know, it's a mountain to move and it's a very delicate situation to talk to them. But mostly they are accepting and they are willing to cooperate. Now, in the place where I'm working now, that moment is actually catching on. So the cardiologist started referring patients, the pulmonologist started referring patients, so nephrologist started referring patients. So it's slowly happening. But you know, it is a mountain of a task to move the doctors. Actually, not the patients. The patients, once if they become aware that such a palliative, you know, care exists in the hospital, they will call us, but not the doctors. It's very difficult to convince the doctors, but we are trying to do that.
Can I suggest also another constituency that can help spread the word? It's a constituency that usually has the confidence of patients and families, unless there's an exception, is the faith communities. And if you can get the leaders of the faith communities to be educated about palliative care, so they can recommend it, whether it's in the church or the mosque or the temple or where, because I mentioned in my presentation that all the faiths of the world support palliative care, and we have these charters that say we've got literature and evidence on it. But again, most people don't know, and a lot of Catholics think they have to just persist till the bitter end with all kinds of treatments. It's just not true. The Catechism of the Catholic Church actually includes the words palliative care. It says it's a special form of disinterested charity. It's an incredible phrase. It says you shouldn't do futile, or they call it overzealous treatment. And there's a lot of Catholic teachings which talk about palliative care being what needs to be the answer. So also in Islam, opioids are not considered haram. Palliative care is a very good thing for most people of the Islamic faith, Buddhist faith, obviously. I'm not an expert on Hinduism, but I do know that there's quite a few Hindu temple situations where there are hospices. So I think that that's another constituency that really can help you spread the word.
Madam, now that you brought that aspect up, there is one thing which is interesting, which I have come to notice recently. When you give beautiful care to a patient, the family notices that, and the family takes it up as a mission. You know, now we want to spread, this is what happened today actually. The family wants to spread the word to their relatives and their friends and their, you know all people. And the beautiful thing right now is they all have small WhatsApp groups. So they said, okay, we are going to put in our WhatsApp group. It could be say 10 people, it could be 20 people, or it could be 50 people, and that would spread. And word of the mouth, even now for doctors, which are what I believe, than flashy advertisements, is the best thing to advocate medical practice. So that's also happening.
Thank you. I think Dr. Vidyasaran was trying to say something.
Yes, ma'am. While everyone we are all discussing about lack of awareness among the professionals and everything, there is also lack of awareness among the patients and the community level peoples also. They don't know actually what palliative care is. While we talking, as I'm working in the oncology institution, while I'm going and talking about the palliative care to the people, they are thinking that patient is going to die within 2 weeks or 1 week, so only they are going and coming and talking to us about the palliative care and everything. They doesn't know that we are going to talk to them about the quality of life and everything we are going to talk. But that is the one awareness. What I want to do was, we have to create the community level education to improve the
Yes.
facilities also. That is the one thing we have to concentrate on. That is my point of view.
Can Dr. Sunil, can I just show one diagram, please, before we close? I know we're way over.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
I want you to see this picture where this is what we came up with, which is palliative care. The perception is that it is end of life care. But especially in countries like ours, where disease-specific treatment does not reach people in time or adequately, the community support is really essential, is foundational and fundamental. And pain and symptom control is there. There's interdisciplinary care, but this is our concentrated and collective message that we have to work on. We have to engage every single person from the community level, the family caregiver, education, in not just for medical education, even in regular education. Why do we not have more conversations about illness? And today everybody is either going to need care, or they're a caregiver, or they've had some experience of it. So we need to really advocate for this awareness at every level. So thank you for raising that point. I think it's an absolutely essential point.
Thank you, Smriti. I think we need to wind up the session now. So let me thank Katherine Pettus, who took a lot of effort. Even she recorded her session because she had power failures in her place. But she took all the effort to do this session. So thank you, Katherine. And she left us because she has to attend another meeting. And thank you, Smriti, for taking us through one of the important developments in India about the NDPS Act and how it worked and what were the advocacy that we have done for that, etc. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody for your active participation. And it's over to Smriti.
Thank you so much. Smriti ma'am, I think this is the continuous 6th hour that you are in front of an audience, because I have been seeing you from 3 o'clock. I'm not sure till how long you have been doing this work for the day. So thank you so much. You are still vibrant. Happy Women's Day to all the ladies out there. And please do convey Pallium India's Women's Day wishes to all the beautiful ladies in your life also. So this is Sripriya along with Dr. Sunil Kumar and Ms. Smriti Rana signing off from the Pallium India's desk. See you in the next session. Till then, everyone take care.
Same wishes to you too.
Thank you, sir.